Hi, I'm Bryan Paul. Welcome to another episode of Backlogged. In the last years of the NES, when attention was shifting to the Super Nintendo, a few developers were still pushing out their final games for the 8-bit console. A lot of these games represent the NES at its finest, but unfortunately, a lot of them were also overlooked. Which brings us to part 2 of the Gargoyle's Quest trilogy. Gargoyle's Quest 2 was released by Capcom in October of 1992 on the NES. The original Gargoyle's Quest was already an obscure game with an even more obscure premise, playing as the demon Firebrand from the Ghost and Goblin series. It's pretty spectacular that we got a sequel, and pretty unbelievable that it was on a home console. Interestingly, Gargoyle's Quest 2 was ported back to the Game Boy with extra levels, but only in Japan. Gargoyle's Quest 1 was a frustrating yet ultimately rewarding experience, so I went into the sequel a bit wary. But right away, I was excited to see the bright colors of the NES shining through, which makes a game with a pretty dark story pretty to look at. Firebrand is big and detailed, and so are the enemies. They all look a bit more demonic now, which for a game like this is obviously appropriate. The levels look great, although I don't think asking for some parallax scrolling would have been asking for too much. Firebrand sprints around the overworld like an Olympic runner. It certainly speeds up exploration and traveling from town to town. In fact, one of my minor gripes of the original Gargoyle's Quest has been addressed here. The random battles in the overworld are way less frequent, and by less frequent, I mean non-existent. Capcom removed them entirely. I'll be honest, this kind of sucks. There's barely anything to do in the overworld as it is. Very few secrets to find, very few NPCs, and now without random battles, it's all kind of pointless. But fear not, even without random battles, the difficulty in this sequel has not taken a hit. I'd say the bosses are harder, though the levels are slightly easier, and I think that can be attributed to the improved controls. Everything moves slightly smoother than it did on the Game Boy, so controls feel a bit more responsive by default. Capcom also fixed my other gripe from Gargoyle's Quest. You can now press down when gripping a wall to drop. You don't have to jump into spikes above you anymore. It's not a problem you'd run into very often, but be thankful that it's no longer an issue. Everything here is reminiscent of the first game. The music, the graphics, the gameplay, it's all really good, but it's all really the same. Not a bad thing, but I was definitely hoping for a bit more. In fact, Gargoyle's Quest 2 isn't really a sequel at all. Story-wise, it's a prequel, but just like the first game, the story is pretty irrelevant. It exists only to give you a reason to get from point A to point B. It's not bad, but I never really felt connected to the characters or cared about their world. Though, on the plus side, at least this action RPG focuses on what it's good at, the action. Dying and retrying are what gives Gargoyle's Quest 2 its legs. It's super old school like that, so you need to practice, memorize, and die a lot to get anywhere. Without all the dying, the game feels really short, which it is, but at least it doesn't overstay its welcome. Gargoyle's Quest 2 feels a lot like the original. Getting to play it on improved hardware with slightly better controls makes it all worthwhile. Still frustrating and still a lot of fun, this NES prequel gets an 8.5 out of 10. So that's it for part 2 of 3 of this episode of Backlogged. I'm super excited to play Demon's Crest on the Super Nintendo, the third and final game in the Gargoyle's Quest series. In the meantime, keep up to date with myself and Mike Zeller on our every week podcast, Gaming Without Parole. It's a show about gaming news and gaming past, and you'll find it every week here on YouTube. As always, thank you for watching.